Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, January 17th, and our friend Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be back.
Let's get started, Ambassador, with what has happened between Israel and Hamas, a ceasefire, which was reported by Haaretz as a deal forced by Donald Trump. And many people are now asking, why did the Biden administration not try to do that? They had more than a year of this conflict in Gaza, but they didn't do anything about it.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Biden administration was mainly focused on supporting Israel rather than doing any kind of negotiations. Antony Blinken is very sympathetic to the Israelis. He's a Zionist. He has no connection to the Palestinians. I think Bill Burns, the CIA director, a very accomplished diplomat, did his best with the instructions he got. But every time there was an agreement with Hamas, Netanyahu would sabotage it. And that was the case. The deal that so-called deal that has finally emerged, and I will explain why I call it a so-called deal, basically is what Biden proposed 6 months ago. Hamas agreed to that then. Netanyahu then added additional conditions. This is the way he acts. You can't make an agreement with him because he will not keep it. He will keep adding conditions. He will charge you with violating the agreement when that charge is baseless, and use that as an excuse to wriggle out of whatever commitment he appeared to have made. So what is interesting is that the Biden administration, which, as I indicated, really I don't think made a serious effort at all, although they claim they did allow Mr. Trump's representative to join the talks. And he very abruptly, almost a week ago, on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, insisted on seeing Mr. Netanyahu. And I guess he spoke pretty bluntly to Mr. Netanyahu: you have to sign on this deal. We're not going to allow you to do what you've continuously done. Mr. Trump positioned himself to do this very adroitly. First, he issued a warning about there will be hell to pay if there's no hostage agreement by the time of my inauguration. That was seen as a warning to Hamas. That was ingratiated him with the Israel lobby and with the Israeli government, and seemed to forecast a strong pro-Israeli position for his administration. But he then turned around and aired Jeff Sachs' video, in which Sachs condemned Netanyahu, in my view correctly, for being dishonest and also for being arrogant and for leading the United States around by the nose. That put Mr. Netanyahu on notice that Mr. Trump was not going to simply follow every dictate that came from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So that set the stage. But typically what has happened, you can already see it, is the usual Israeli practice. If you look back on all of the Israeli negotiations, Camp David, for example, way back when, and more recently, you see a common pattern. Israel will go for the short-term benefits that an agreement provides Israel, and it is prepared to make concessions. So in this case, it has agreed to release people with life sentences in Israeli jails, the Palestinian hostages, in return for the Israeli hostages. That's an immediate benefit for Israel that will help in domestic politics in Israel, and which will make Israel more acceptable to Jewish communities outside Israel. But typically, Israel then says, well, with regard to all the other issues, we can work those out later. It implies that it will be reasonable, but it never is. And so we have already seen the news has just broken that apparently the Biden administration, in order to get this agreement, gave Israel permission to restart the war whenever it wants. So basically, what we have is a brief pause in Israel's genocide, not a real ceasefire. And we also don't know what sweetener Mr. Witkoff, the representative of President-elect Trump, may have offered to Netanyahu to compensate for whatever tough love he gave him. It's entirely possible that he committed the United States under Trump to join in an attack on Iran, for example, which is something that Netanyahu really wants. In return for making concessions on Gaza. And the final point I'd make here is that Netanyahu's war cabinet and his cabinet in general are dominated by religious Zionists who are committed to the expansion of Israeli territory and to the removal or extermination of its Palestinian inhabitants. So the cabinet, in approving the so-called deal, that is the pause in the fighting, during which some hostages will be exchanged, the cabinet also authorized a major expansion of the ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank. So I think there's a real question now, what is Mr. Trump going to do? He might very well feel, as his predecessors have, that he's been taken to the cleaners by Netanyahu, that Netanyahu has duped him, and that he has been betrayed by Netanyahu. So I don't know what he's going to do. I'm not sure that he knows. But there is much less to this so-called deal than a lot of pundits have been saying. It's basically just a few-week pause in the fighting, if that. And finally, I just note that we don't have an accurate picture of what has been going on, in part because the press has been excluded completely from Gaza. So we know that the actual death count for Palestinians is more likely close to 200,000 or so than the 47,000 that have been reported. We also know that there have been 120,000 or so wounded on the Palestinian side in a situation where there is no medical care because the Israelis have systematically destroyed it. Israeli casualties, the deaths, have been relatively few, maybe less than 500 over the course of the 16 months or so of this campaign of annihilation against the Palestinians. But there have been over 40,000 wounded. The low number of deaths reflects the fact that modern medicine is much better at saving lives than in previous wars. It also reflects the fact that Israel's fighting only a few miles from its own hospitals. So it can medically evacuate the wounded and give them treatment. But there is a very large unknown number out of that 40,000 who have been disabled, whose lives have basically been ruined. And the IDF also, the Israeli Defense Forces, also point to the fact that a huge number of Israelis have now got mental problems as a result of what they participated in and did in Gaza. So this isn't over, and we do not have a good picture of what is likely to happen. You're muted.
Coming back to the question that I had, why did the Biden administration not try to convince Netanyahu to go after some sort of ceasefire? Here is what Joe Biden said on MSNBC days after October 7th and the meeting he had with Netanyahu.
I went to Israel immediately after their attack by Hamas, 8 days later, whatever it was. And I told him we were going to help. And I said, but Bibi, I said, you can't be carpet bombing these communities. And he said to me, well, you did it. You carpet bomb, not his exact words, but you carpet bomb Berlin, you dropped a nuclear weapon. You killed thousands of innocent people because you had to in order to win a war. I said, but that's why we came up with the UN. New deals by which what we would do relative to civilians and military.
So he was comparing 21st century war tactics, battle tactics, with World War II.
Well, what he was really doing is he was going after me for saying you can't indiscriminately bomb civilian areas, even if the bad guys are there. Even if the bad guys there, you can't take out 2, 10, 12, 1,500 people, innocent people, in order to get the one bad guy. And he made a legitimate argument. His perspective said, look, these are the guys that kill my people. These are the guys that are all over in these tunnels. Nobody had any idea the miles of tunnels are down there. It's amazing what they built.
Yeah, he said he made a legitimate argument. Why does the United States president not know how to respond to these manipulative arguments?
I think that's a question that a lot of historians are going to be very interested in. I think Mr. Biden has shown on multiple occasions that he has very poor judgment. This is very poor judgment indeed. What he has done effectively over the last 16 months is destroy the entire fabric of international law, destroy the credibility of the UN Charter and the United Nations, which he referred to, destroy the laws of war. He has aided and abetted, not just condoned, he has aided and abetted genocide, while his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor deny that there is genocide. They think there's genocide in Xinjiang in China, where people are being re-educated and forcibly assimilated, much as the United States did and Canada did and Australia did with indigenous people. That is a crime, I agree. That is bad behavior, but it is not genocide by any definition. They have announced there is genocide in Sudan. Why? Basically, because they want to be on, quote, the right side of history, unquote. But they are entirely on the wrong side of history in the case of Israel and Palestine. And this is not going to be Mr. Biden's legacy, when it's judged by historians, will carry this very, very dark mark on it. And I would note, finally, Nima, that, as an American, I'm disgusted with this kind of posture on the part of our government, but I'm far from alone. All of the polls show that young Americans, in particular, young Jewish Americans, overwhelmingly believe there is genocide being committed in Gaza and don't want to be associated with it. The American people oppose the weapons sales to Israel, or weapons gifts to Israel, more accurately, that Biden has carried out. Now, having said all of that, I don't see much prospect of an improvement under Mr. Trump. He may react viscerally to the essential betrayal of him and his envoy by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He may be angry. He does have a habit of getting angry at people who don't follow his direction. And that might lead him to do something by way of pressure on Israel. But otherwise, he's been, he's the one who illegally recognized the incorporation of the Golan Heights into Israel. He's the one who moved the embassy to Jerusalem in total contradiction to international law and repeated Security Council decisions. He has no respect for precedents, for rules. He is emotional, and he acts on the basis of his gut, not his brain sometimes. So we can't tell what he will do. It would be hard to be worse than Joe Biden. But if anyone could achieve that, it would be Donald Trump.
And when you look at the current state of the relationship in the Middle East, do you think that Donald Trump, many people are arguing right now that the main goal of Donald Trump is getting back to Abraham Accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Is that the case right now in the mind of Trump and his administration?
I don't know what he's thinking. I think it's too early to make that judgment. Obviously, he took great pride in the Abraham Accords. But let's remember the essence of the Abraham Accords was an effort, with an attempt, apparently successful at the time, to set the Palestinian self-determination issue aside, to bypass it, to leave it as something that can't be discussed, and distract attention by building a normal relationship for Israel in the Middle East. Israel is very peculiar. Its mentality, the way it thinks it wants to be European, but it's situated in the middle of West Asia. It has no relationship that is anything but cold or hateful with any of its neighbors, and it is not prepared to coexist with the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. So the prospects, the Abraham Accords were quite an achievement. They were basically led by the United Arab Emirates, which is a classically realpolitik practicing country, totally practical, and it saw benefits in this. But don't forget, it also demanded, and Israel appeared to imply, that it would agree to a halt in settlements in the West Bank. Not the exact opposite happened. So again, this is the typical Israeli pattern. Accept something for short-term benefit, promise things in the longer term, and then don't deliver them. And what has happened since Mr. Trump left office, among other things, is this war with, I hate to call it a war because it's an annihilation. It's a massacre. It's genocide of the Palestinians. And this has horrified everyone in the world outside a few countries in the collective West, which are committed to Israel, regardless of what it does. So if you run a poll anywhere in the Arab world or in Iran or anywhere in the Islamic world, you would find nobody approves of the Abraham Accords. And they are basically on life support. And there are severe limits to what the Saudi government under Mohammed bin Salman can do with Israel when his public is utterly 99% opposed to doing anything with Israel. And it all comes back. I remember my deputy in Riyadh when I was ambassador there, before I arrived, had a conversation with the late King Abdullah, then the Crown Prince, and he asked him to do something, and Abdullah's response was, "Well, a friend who doesn't help you is no better than an enemy who does you no harm. So the United States is a friend, so I will do this thing, even though I don't think it makes sense." Later, I was present when Abdullah was talking to a group of advocates for Israel. And they kept saying, you have to do something nice for Israel, and the Israelis then will do something nice back, which is not anything that has any evidence behind it. But anyway, it sounded good. And Abdullah finally said, "I have a message for your Israeli friends." He said, "Tell them, if they want to be loved, they should do something lovable. Well, if they want to be hated, they should do something hateful. And they have done the most hateful things of anyone in the 21st century. They have replicated exactly everything minus the gas chambers, what was done to European Jews by the Nazis. And the world sees this and is horrified by the sadism, the cruelty that has been on evidence and has been presented to the International Criminal Court, is being used to track down individual Israeli soldiers who are guilty of crimes against humanity, participating in genocide. Things have changed. It was once possible to accept Israel as a reality, regardless of its amorality. That is not easy now. So I think this may very well be a Trump desire. And I think in the end, Israel in the long run, if it's going to survive, has to, and not go the way of the little Christian kingdoms 800 years ago or so. It is going to have to make peace with its neighbors. It's going to have to come to grips with the issue of coexisting with the Palestinians. It shows no sign of wanting to do that. Therefore, I think its long-term existence is in jeopardy, and Mr. Netanyahu has done more than anyone else to create that situation, which I deplore. There are many decent people in Israel who are Jewish, who are Jewish Israelis. He's put them in danger. He's also put international Jewish communities in danger, because to the extent that the world's Jews are seen to be automatic supporters of genocide, of cruelties, of raping prisoners, of raping women, of the sorts of things that Israel has been proven to carry out, that leads to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in the West, at least, was a sort of an undercurrent that had not entirely disappeared. But there's an upsurge now, and it's all due to what Israel is doing.
Yeah, here is a survey, Ambassador, that shows that anti-Semitism from 2014 to 2024 has increased, has doubled. And
yeah, but of course you have to recognize that the Anti-Defamation League, which that comes from, has a peculiar definition of anti-Semitism. It considers criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitism. But I don't think Israel has a great deal to do with Judaism. In fact, I think it is a disgrace to Judaism. It is the negation of Judaism. It does not follow the values of Judaism. It does the opposite. There's nothing in Judaism that authorizes sadistic cruelty to people.
here is, Ambassador, when it comes to the future of Zionism, here is Israeli historian talking about the future of Israel, the future of Zionism.
Say with some caution that this is the last phase of Zionism. Historically, such development in ideological movements, whether they are colonials or empires, doesn't matter, in the past, it's usually the final chapter, the ruthless one, the most ambitious one, and then it's too much, and then they fall and collapse.
Ilan Pappé is an example of a very great Jewish tradition of ruthless honesty. Judaism, I think, is admirable as a religion because of two things. First, it emphasizes the pursuit of justice. And second, the pursuit of truth through ethical reasoning. And Ilan Pappé, who I think still lives in Haifa in Israel, is very outspoken and ruthlessly honest, which is why he has a lot of concern. He should have a lot of concerns about his life, given his fellow Israeli Jews' attitudes. They call him a Nazi because he opposes genocide. How ironic can you be to call someone a Nazi because they're against genocide? But he's not alone. There are many other great men and women in Jewish communities around the world and in Israel who see the truth and are not afraid to speak it. So I admire him. I admire the others.
Ambassador, when it comes to ceasefire, we've learned that Ben Gvir he's talking about leaving the government and resigning. How he says that this ceasefire would be a total defeat or is a surrender to Hamas, in his opinion. When you look at Israel today, militarily and economically, it's totally dependent on the United States. They have destroyed their economy during this conflict. And what comes to the mind of these people who are suggesting the continuation of the behavior that, as you mentioned, that they were committing for more than a year?
Well, Mr. Ben Gvir and Mr. Smotrich, although they are not happy with each other, are both religious fanatics. They are the Jewish equivalent of Daesh, of the Islamic State. They may not behead people, but they shoot people in the head. They bomb them, they kill them, they torture them, so you have to consider what sort of man this is, and what he represents in Israeli politics, which is a very substantial strain of opinion, which is completely racist, completely sadistic, and completely hateful. Now, I don't know that he's going to leave the cabinet because basically Mr. Biden gave Netanyahu the out. He said, okay, you can agree to this thing now, but then you can start the war up anytime you want. And that is based, and he also, Netanyahu, as I mentioned earlier, also turned around and redoubled the effort to do ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Deploying more troops there, more violence, more support of the settlers' violence, the pogroms, in an effort to root out the Palestinians. This is Ben Gvir's program. It is Smotrich's program. So I think they've been paid off basically by Biden. Will Mr. Trump allow them to cash that check? I don't know. He's never agreed to be bound by anything that Joe Biden did. So we'll see. But I'm not convinced that Ben Gvir is going to give up his role in politics in Israel.
And the situation in Ukraine, which is one of the greatest challenges that Donald Trump would face. And when it comes to the solution, many people are arguing that the solution would be between the United States and Russia. But we know that Europe has been suffering during this conflict a lot. There has to be a European partner or all the European countries together participating in any sort of talk and negotiations. How do you find it?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the major disastrous effects of this war has been to divide Europe. And I think on the Russian side in particular, there's a sense of grievance that Russia was put in a corner. Russia has suffered terribly by losing a lot of men on the battlefield, and having to reorient itself away from Europe toward China, toward West Asia, South Asia, and I mean India, China, and so forth, the Arab world, and Africa. And people are very patriotic. They don't want to make any concessions to achieve peace. I think the Europeans have been living in a dream world. They have inhaled their own propaganda. They're shocked to find out that, in fact, Ukraine has lost the war, basically. There will be a negotiation. One thing that you have to remember always in every negotiation, whatever it's about, is a negotiation about two things. One is the terms of the specific issues, and the other is the nature of the relationship you have with the other party. And Russia has a big problem. It has to reconcile Europe to the defeat of NATO in Ukraine, and to a new situation in which Ukraine is partitioned. The Russian-speaking areas will be under Russian control one way or another. I mean, I think that is I've argued that Russia should remember what Churchill advised, and that is to be magnanimous in victory. But I don't think the Russian mood is very supportive of that, and I understand that completely. Nevertheless, it's an essential thing. Russia, in the long run, cannot change its geography. It is part of Europe as well as part of Asia. And so it needs to repair its image, its relationships, its cooperation with other Europeans. And those other Europeans, in turn, need to remember their history. They can't have peace and stability without a decent relationship with Russia, which is part of Europe, whether they like it or not. And so I think both sides face a very difficult challenge of trying to overcome all of the emotional debris that the fighting has strewn about their societies. And it won't be easy at all, and it will take time. This is quite aside from the difficulty of the issues themselves. What about the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine? What about the Ukraine-Russia border? What about Ukraine's place in European security architecture? These are the issues that began the war. These are the issues that Putin's government demanded be negotiated. When the West refused to negotiate these issues, Mr. Putin executed the ultimatum that he'd given. And all these issues are there. They're not easy issues, as we've discussed before. But underlying all of this is the necessity. No war ends until the enemy, whoever it is, has accepted the realities that the war has produced. And Europeans are going to find it very hard to accept the realities that the battlefield in Ukraine has produced. Russians have sacrificed greatly to achieve those realities. Ukrainians have been in the middle, and I really feel sorry for them. Ukraine, as you said, you didn't say, but Ukraine's economy has been destroyed. Ukraine's society has been destroyed. Ukraine has been depopulated. There are huge numbers of dead and wounded in Ukraine. A whole generation has gone. This Ukraine is crippled, and it is not going to emerge from this war except as a greatly reduced state. And if the war goes on long enough, it may lose the Russian-speaking or traditional Russian areas along the Black Sea, in addition to Crimea, and end up with no access to the sea. So Ukraine has to negotiate with Russia. NATO, Europe has to be in the room when anything is worked out, because Europe is going to be left holding the bag, whatever comes out of the US-Russian negotiation. And people have to start focusing on how to build a peace. I don't see any evidence of thinking either in Moscow or in Brussels or in Washington or Paris or Berlin about that question. But that is now the most urgent question. How do we replace hatred, recriminations, disinformation, warfare with cooperation in Europe? How do we do that? You can't do that in 24 hours. I'm sorry to say.
Do you feel that Donald Trump and his people would let Germany to reconnect the pipeline between Russia and Germany, which would hugely contribute to the security of Europe together with Russia?
Well, I think any peace in Europe is going to have to include the resumption of normal trade linkages between East and West, between the Russians and the rest of Europe, and that would certainly be part of it. The U.S. has, if we're going to have peace, Russia has to stop treating NATO as an enemy, and NATO has to stop treating Russia as an enemy. And we have to agree, well, okay, we are going to be vigilant, we're going to be cautious, we're going to retain the capability to act militarily if we have to, but we're going to work to make sure that we don't have to do that. And so the United States is going to, at the end of this, I am very convinced the United States will find that it has a reduced role in Europe. And this is very much in line with Mr. Trump's apparent thinking about the issue. He is not a great fan of NATO. and troops in Europe. So we'll see what happens. But one of the most perplexing things, of course, is that Mr. Trump is very unpredictable, and where you and I might see a certain logic, he might not agree. We will see.
Ambassador, how important is the new comprehensive deal between Russia and Iran, which we know has been signed today, and for the policies that the United States would make toward Russia and Iran?
I think it's a major development. It's the culmination of some very foolish policies by the United States, which have had the effect of unifying rather than dividing our declared adversaries. So, we have decided that Iran is the enemy, and Iranians at the official level see us appropriately as the enemy. But we've also made an enemy of Russia. We've made an enemy of China. We've made an enemy of North Korea. And so we have this so-called axis of resistance that's come into being. Resistance to what? Resistance to American hegemony. Normally, this is really quite extraordinary if you think about it. If anyone who knows any history knows that Persia, Iran, and Russia have been historic enemies, and that a great deal of Central Asia, which was basically controlled by or part of the Persian Empire at various points, was taken by the Russian Empire. The same thing is true of Russia and Turkey. They were historic enemies. The same thing is true of Russia and China. Beginning in their first contact in the 1640s, Cossacks arriving in Siberia was very unfortunate. The greatest territorial losses of the Qing or Manchu Empire in China were to Russia. And of course, the Koreans and the Chinese don't like each other. Korea has been invaded 72 times in its history, almost always from what is now China, or China itself. We have managed to unite all these countries despite their historic enmity. And that is quite an achievement. Or I should say, it's a very unfortunate, counterproductive thing to have accomplished. And people who dream about pulling what they call a reverse Nixon-Kissinger, so we flip Russia into an ally against China, don't understand quite how much has gone on. These countries are now, the significance of the Russian Federation agreement is that there will now be a great deal more integration between these two countries. Economic integration, political cooperation, and military cooperation. So this is not exactly an alliance, but it is a commitment to develop relations to a level that is unprecedented. It's a big deal, I agree.
That's so amazing to me that these countries are not talking about any sort of alliance. Even between Russia and China, you don't see they're talking about these things. But it seems that they have some sort of partnership that can go beyond alliance.
Well, I think they have something in common, and that is the realization that allies who cannot contribute to your defense are liabilities, not assets. In other words, if you have an ally, let's say the United States has an ally in South Korea. What does South Korea do for the United States? Well, it allows troops to be settled there. In peacetime, we can transit South Korea to other parts of Asia. But in the end, South Korea cannot help us very much anywhere. It understands that. That is why it participated in the Vietnam War on our side. That is why it sent troops to Iraq during the unfortunate occupation of Iraq. It wanted to demonstrate that it was a sincere friend of the United States. But in the end, it's the United States that protects South Korea, not vice versa. So this means if South Korea decides for some reason that it wants to go to war with North Korea, the United States is in that war. So that is a risk. It is not an advantage. And I think the Chinese certainly don't have any alliances. They have an implied defense commitment to North Korea because they want a buffer stating, but it's strictly Chinese interests that dictate this. They have a relationship with Pakistan because Pakistan reduces Indian hegemony in South Asia, but they have no alliance commitment. They have no specific commitment. They have a relationship with Europe, with Russia, which I would call an entente. That is a French term that means a limited partnership for limited purposes, for contingencies. It's not a broad commitment to defend Russia, and in fact, China has not defended Russia. China exercises militarily with Russia. It cooperates technologically with Russia. It has not stopped doing so because of the war in Ukraine. And the United States, rather foolishly, in my view, sees this as pro-Russian. No, it isn't. It's neutral. It's only if you agree that you're either with the United States or against us. If you're not with the United States, if you don't sign on the dotted line and adopt the policies the United States advocates, then in our definition, you're against us. So you're not neutral, but nobody else sees it that way. I think one of the things that I've been interested in is the loss of diplomatic vocabulary, specialized terms. An alliance is a broad mutual commitment to aid each other. It is unconditional. That is the kind of relationship the United States has had with Great Britain. It is mutual. An entente is a commitment to address contingencies together. Preferably, you define those contingencies. And we have client states who basically, in return for giving us advantages, expect our protection. So these are all different categories. They're not, the word ally is spread around with a total abandonment. An ally is something more than a country you have a cordial relationship with. No, we have a formal alliance with Brazil in the Inter-American, the Rio Treaty. Is that a real alliance? I mean, does Brazil plan to go to war to defend the United States in, let's say, Korea, if we get into a war there, or with China? The answer is absolutely not. So what is this? This is an agreement to cooperate under certain circumstances, which are yet to be defined. I think we need to re-examine our vocabulary and be more precise, because this is not a bipolar order anymore. It is plurilateral. It is, I call it multinodal. It is more than multipolar in my view. And we don't have the diplomatic historical knowledge or vocabulary to deal accurately with it. So what is going on between Iran and Russia? This is an entente. What is going on between Russia and China? It is an entente. These are limited partnerships for limited purposes. The limits can be expanded if it is convenient to both sides. And the Chinese and the Russians say there are no limits, which means that they're prepared to explore cooperation to any level. Doesn't mean they're committed to it. I think the same will prove true with Iran.
There was an article in the Telegraph yesterday that it was analyzing 3 scenarios under which they can put their troops underground in Ukraine. It's absurd when you look at the article. Do you know why they're so obsessed with the conflict in Ukraine? I'm talking about the United Kingdom.
Well, they had a good deal to do with keeping it going. I mean, after all, Boris Johnson was the one who trashed the draft treaty that had been reached between Russia and Ukraine. The British seem to see playing the role of warmongering against Russia as very cementing their support from the United States. They are singing to the choir more loudly than anybody in Europe. What is the strategic interest there? It's not clear to me. But then, of course, it's never been clear what the objectives of the West are in Ukraine. What circumstances would have justified declaring victory? We don't know. We basically provoked this war by refusing to negotiate. What did we hope to get from it? The only answer we have, there are two answers. One, we intended to weaken and isolate Russia. Well, that doesn't do anything for Ukraine. And second, when asked, well, what would satisfy that requirement, the answer was whatever it takes, for as long as it takes, which is no answer at all. This is yet another forever war, which I define as a war with no clear objectives, or no war termination strategy, and no prospect of no diplomacy, really, just fighting. There's been no diplomacy. If the Biden administration essentially colluded with the Israeli government to continue the war against the Palestinians and to extend it to Lebanon, if that was the role of the Biden administration there, then in the Ukraine context, it has been totally absent from any negotiation, any diplomatic communication with Russia. And the only activities that it's conducted have been pep rallies for Ukraine. I mean, I'm very sorry for the Ukrainians. I think they've been badly used. And I think it's time to find an end to this that will preserve as much as we can of Ukraine and lay a basis for addressing Ukraine's many problems. Its lack of democracy, its lack of press freedom, its corruption, many, many problems, which all can be addressed in the context of Ukraine joining the European Union if the European Union wants to have it. But there is no instant answer. And Ukraine going into the EU without addressing these problems, and also some conflicts of interest, like how do you deal with French agriculture when you bring Ukraine into the European agricultural policy? This is going to take a lot of time, a lot of thought. Ukraine has to be almost raised from the dead at this point.
Yeah. Here is Donald Trump talking about that he called Xi Jinping in China. And he said, President Xi and I will do everything possible to make the world more peaceful and safe. Do you understand the policy of Donald Trump right now toward China?
Not at all. I note that he never has a bad phone call. He talked to President Sheinbaum in Mexico and described it as a wonderful conversation in which various things agreed. And then she made it clear that that was not at all what had happened. So I think Donald Trump has the idea that if he knows someone, his charm is so irresistible that they will do what he wants. But in fact, people don't behave that way, at least in international politics. And I don't think they behave that way in New York real estate either. And Mr. Trump's negotiating style is a strange combination of this kind of exaggeration of friendship and courtesy and thuggery, bluster, and threats. Carrots and sticks, yes, but many more sticks than carrots, I think.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Well, thank you for what you do.